invite the next set of speakers to stage, Megan and team. Kim, Sheree, Michelle. All right. It's Mike. You want to kick off the discussion on responsible AI? So Kim, I know you have a talk later. So what are the best practices in generative AI and explaining how LLMs are performing and bias detection that you're looking at?
Well, generally with LLMs, similar to unsupervised learning, we're concerned with both how the LLM performs in general. So it's good to have a set of benchmarks to try to test various factors like the trustworthiness of the answer for the LLM, or the fairness, or how well it protects private information. So one thing is just setting up a set of benchmarks that you can use to test how well your LLM is doing in general. And also accuracy for individual responses. You want to have some system set up to check individual responses that they're people are usually using guardrails right now just to check whether the response is breaking any obvious fairness rules or giving inaccurate information. Those are the main two categories of things that you want to look at.
I think the clustering of concepts, which we were looking at earlier. I think in the presentation that Agus had on complaints, we picked up some of that techniques. Probably you want to touch on how conceptual soundness can come into play in model responses when they are large language models.
Yeah, you certainly want to be able to summarize different responses that the LLM's producing, and sometimes that can be done by switching things into embedding space and finding what clusters are occurring in a low-dimensional embedding space. So then you can reduce the problem to understanding what each cluster is doing, and in some cases keywords for each cluster can be useful in interpretation.
Megan, how are customers striving to get explainability for or even bring responsible AI best practices? You demoed model documentation today, and what are other techniques that they are bringing to bear?
Well, Kim mentioned a few of them, but I would say that a lot of times with the large language models, if it's not explainable, you're asking the wrong question. So you really want to think about how do you ask this in a way that it's explainable. So for example, when we were doing that model documentation demo, I could ask it to summarize, and I could check what it used, but it's still not completely hallucination free, right? It's always just predicting the next token. But instead, I could say, what pieces of the document, what paragraphs would you use if you had to generate this content? So actually use the text. And I could phrase it in that way. Then I have a completely explainable documentation. So you have to think kind of out of the box about, you're just asking questions. What are the questions you would ask to make it completely trustworthy, explainable, really easy to see? And I think what we're learning is that even though there are guardrails that are in place and different techniques, the best way to make sure it's responsible and explainable is something that's easy to check. And that's why I think with the enterprise H2O GPT, having the content highlighted of where it's taking it and having that really clear transparency is key, because it makes it so much easier to check it and feel comfortable with the results.
What work are I know Navdeep and you wrote AI governance. The room is filled with governance, AI governance in machine learning models and AI for practitioners. What are themes that you're seeing that customers are, and our own team is working on for governance in AI?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing our customers being kind of the driving forces for gathering requirements from. They're the experts in their domain. They're the ones that know the most about the regulations in their industry. And so what we're really trying to do on our platform side is gather these requirements that our customers know, but also kind of evaluate the different proposed regulations, the different frameworks. You demoed earlier the Compare app that shows kind of the consistencies or similarities between different, for example, the EU AI Act, maybe the NIST framework. Like, what are the different things that we're identifying that are consistent patterns, and how can we enable our customers as they're using our AI platform to be able to prepare the required documentation to capture the necessary metrics as they're building AI. So we're not really doing a bunch of validation and documentation at the end of the development lifecycle, but throughout the entire process. So that's kind of what we're trying to build throughout the platform, these things that proactively help our customers comply and build out a responsible AI kind of and governance practice at their organization.
Well, governance often is well, maybe a question for all three of you. If you had to rank order, is governance a domain challenge? Is it a technology challenge? Or is it a cultural challenge? How would you rank them? Which would be first, second, third?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think all of them kind of bring in their own challenges. Initially, what spurs a lot of companies or organizations to start thinking about governance is from a regulatory perspective. And so when those are implemented, people really start prioritizing this area. But in order for effective AI governance to happen at an organization, it has to happen top down. So from a leadership perspective, kind of creating a risk tolerance strategy, being able to implement those processes throughout the organization comes from like a leadership perspective. So from there on, you establish like a process that the rest of your organization can execute as you're building out these AI projects. So a bit of the combination of all of the ones that you mentioned.
And I would add the cultural piece as well, because I think there's this this thinking that the governance reduces the accuracy of the model, and it's kind of like lowering what can be done, but in reality it's a really good sound way to check a model, and it's almost like enforcing best practices. So I feel like it's somewhat culture as well, to think of it as not as almost improving your accuracy, because you're making a model that's more generalizable, more stable.
Kim, thoughts on that?
I didn't have more to add.
Well, I mean, oftentimes regulation, and probably a question for the second half of the day as well, is considered that it's slowing down model building. What are you seeing, and how are you going about? Is evaluation a net positive? Is it going to help, or is it going to hurt? Is it actually giving you a false sense of security, or is it actually helping you prevent accidents?
I think it definitely it slows down, because you do have to do a lot of additional steps. But I would say that people are. It's really important to be granular, especially with the model. You want to check it. You want to be focused. You want to see all the bits and pieces of it. You'll really understand how well it works, versus kind of just knowing a little bit about it or being superficially aware of it. I think it's really important, especially when the model is productionized, because then you have a better sense of how it will react in different situations, and whether it should be taken out immediately of production. That being said, if the framework isn't done well, I'm sure things can slip through the cracks, and like you said, have this false feeling of safety. And I think that's where maybe GenAI will be helpful too, because like I said before, it can take away a lot of that tedious piece that maybe you're spending a lot of time on, and you're kind of using up all your focus on that and not maybe the critical thinking piece where you can really validate how this model is going to do that important higher level thinking.
Yeah, and to add on to that, we have a lot of investment into building out a platform that kind of considers that there might be some slower development process because we need all these documentations, these validation processes and approvals throughout the entire AI development lifecycle. But with our products and the platform, we're trying to enable kind of automated metric capturing documentation along the process. So as model builders are building the model, they can capture the necessary documentation and the necessary, abide by the necessary policies in their company to kind of alleviate these kind of challenges with slowing down development processes at the end. So trying to build a platform that really kind of helps with these problems that we might encounter as we're complying with regulatory frameworks.
Kim, you've spent some time.
Yeah, I'm sure that it does slow things down, but I think it's good to have a checklist to try to understand how your model will affect end users. And I think things will be tricky when people are trying to deploy models maybe in different countries that have different rules on different legal regulations on AI. So that'll probably be a bit tricky for many applications.
Well, I mean, our theme is that brakes are needed to drive faster. The best cars have great brakes, right? So eventually, if you build really good evaluation frameworks, you can actually bring change faster. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Of course, regulation will prefer a government inducted winner in the space. I think regulating the vertical, regulate the application, not the platform. I think that's kind of the place we are generally headed as a team. Kim, I know you've worked closely with some of the nonprofits in the space, like FinReg Law, with Stanford HAI. What kind of industry and academic partnerships and technology partnerships might be needed to do this well? Maybe. Any of you?
Yeah, well, certainly it's always good to have partnerships between academia that are working on very hard technical problems. I did work with FinReg Labs on a project a year or so ago, and they brought a bunch of people together to concentrate on things like what the best methods are for debiasing and how best to analyze fairness for specifically a banking data set. So we ended up finding out what methods everyone was using and which things worked the best. So I think having multiple people from different industries working on a problem is definitely helpful when we're dealing with models that are difficult to analyze.
Yeah, hi everybody. We have an audience question for the panel. Are there any standards or methods for describing an ethical or moral framework for AI to use?
Yeah, there's a lot of frameworks kind of out there. For example, if we take a look at Singapore's AI governance framework, especially for the finance sector, they follow a set of 4 principles called FEAT, F-E-A-T, fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. And these are some common patterns that we're identifying across other frameworks as well. And so with regard to the E in there, the ethics portion, it's really ethics according to kind of your organizational ethics policy. How do you align your AI kind of governance policies with your existing other policies like data privacy regulations and things like that. So how do you align kind of your ethics with AI with what you already have as an organization and what you are required to comply with from a industry standard, from a geo standard? So kind of how do you take the ethics of AI and then make sure they align to what you already have in terms of ethics as a company?
And also, there are definitely benchmarking data sets to try to test how well the model is doing in terms of making ethical decisions. It'll give it an ethical problem and some choices, and see how well it does. Trust LLM had one section of data sets trying to test ethics, so there are definitely some standard data sets you can start with.
As what kind of products are you seeing in the general ecosystem? Say Microsoft's done a ton of work in this space. You're seeing a lot of open source work between the various evaluation frameworks. What are some that come to top of mind that the audience can follow after, in addition to the H2O work?
I would say those that you just mentioned, and we'll talk about Eval Studio and the training today that H2O has. But one thing I just wanted to mention, having worked with a lot of different customers as well, and what I've seen is that a lot of times the generative AI is able to do a lot more than you think, as long as you frame it in a series of steps. And this is a little bit off topic, but we talked about that document difference product, and if I just give it 2 contracts and ask it to do RAG and GenAI and try to figure out the 2 differences, it'll answer, but it won't be exactly what I want, because for contracts, at least, it's very specific. So you kind of have to think about what steps you would do as a person to figure this out. So the first thing I would do is figure out, like, what is a section in a contract? Then the second thing is, well, does this section match this other section? And the third thing is, how are they different? So if you start breaking down your actual process step by step, you're able to do a lot more if you think these bite-sized questions up. And so what I've just been seeing in the industry is that a lot of the harder problems are these step-by-step processes that really need to be customized. And I think today we'll show a lot of applications that have been built, because that's where I see you get a lot more effectiveness with generative AI, being able to kind of make these custom workflows. And I know, that's one of the pieces that I've seen really be valuable.
Yeah, and to add to that, the bite-sized pieces, the processes, and also thinking about AI governance as not just kind of one step that happens at the end. You're done your model, you're about to deploy it. You have to do this one step to make sure that it complies or it's responsible. Implementing responsible AI is something that happens across the entire, again, life cycle. You'll see in one of the flyers that there's this concept of de-risking by design. So throughout your process from organizational planning, of establishing what laws and policies are applicable to your organization, down to kind of building, determining what kind of data you want to use, conducting validation testing, deploying your model, monitoring your model, and then potentially including a human in the decision-making process. Throughout each of these steps, you're essentially de-risking by design, because you're implementing checks. You're making sure that you are following your organizational kind of policies as you're building and developing your model. So that's something that we're seeing in a lot of these frameworks across as well. Like if you see NIST or the EU AI Act, they require you to kind of do things as you're building the model, and not just once you have your model, what are the tests that I can run now just to check off a box. So that's something we're seeing across other platforms as well.
There is another question from the audience, but before I do that, I want to remind everybody there is a QR code on your desk. If you have any questions for this panel, any upcoming panels, please scan that in, and it'll show up on here, and I'll repeat the question. So for the panel, in the banking industry, independent validation is an important component of a model risk management framework. Have you worked with customers on this?
Yes, we have, and I think that's a great framework because it really separates the goal of the model developer is at odds with the validator. So it really helps to make sure that the models are validated correctly. And we've worked with our customers for this. And one of the things that I demoed earlier was the model documentation generator or assistant. And so the goal of that was actually to help assist in generating that model validation document. The validator still needs to obviously do their tests, but again, that kind of time-consuming piece of generating the documentation from the development document can be automated to some degree, or just used as assistance for the validator. So we've definitely worked with our banks on that. The other thing I'll just mention quickly is we have a product called model validation, which actually has a series of tests that are in there that will validate a model depending on the type. If it's time series, it'll do back testing and so on and so forth, to give a quick overview of how well the model performs for these industry standard tests, and give you a sense of would your model pass this validation step as you're building it out.
What about adversarial testing? Can we use an LLM to break an LLM or create at least envelope for safety?
I think generally it's good to understand how robust your model is and how much variance you're going to get for reasonable outputs, because there are so many similar ways that you could phrase something, and you want to know whether doing a bit of prompt engineering is going to change your output much, and whether your model is robust to different reasonable operating conditions. So yeah, I think adversarial testing of that type is necessary if you're going to use an LLM in production.
You could almost think of like generative AI is very similar in a way to machine learning. So just like we do ensembles in machine learning, you could think of that for Gen AI as well. So this isn't exactly adversarial testing, but the idea of asking multiple large language models the same question or slightly different questions to see the answers, and combining those together can create a more stable answer. So not just for adversarial testing, but just to improve the accuracy overall, you can do almost like voting, asking all the large language models the question in different ways.
I think as part of the training, John later today will expose how to break a model, how to make it speak profanity, maybe even what are its limitations and weaknesses. It'd be interesting to see as part of that training how to make the model robust to drift and change. Do you see more questions?
We have a really good question here. How do you assess model risk rating for Gen AI or LLM models? How do you balance complexity versus the impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Balancing complexity versus impact, and also making sure that given a more complex model might be less transparent for general users. How do we include kind of maybe human validation or human in the loop to make sure that we're not just relying on the results of a generative AI model, but we're also incorporating kind of that human feedback to, one, improve these models, and two, ensure that they're not trying to kind of going rogue and just not being the results being used kind of unfiltered or unvalidated by some person. So that's kind of what we're seeing with these more complex models. People are kind of using them more hand-to-hand with a person kind of guiding it, as opposed to just using the results directly in a critical kind of process.
I would say too, again, the large language model is just predicting the next token, so it's the most risky when you're having a talk to customers directly, and that's just the most risky. So you could frame it, how can you still use it and improve your your productivity without necessarily having it be at that most risky level. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So I would say the way you use the large language model would, obviously the risk ranking is going to be related to the value of the model, but also the way you use it is it directly to consumer. Are you doing, as Sheree said, a human in the loop step? Are you using it but saying how the format has to be? So when we saw that Doc AI demo, Mark is having the large language model specifically give the output in a certain way, a format. So it's, for example, use a large language model to tell me which section of this driver's license is most likely to be the name. So it's going to have to give, there's only a certain few options it can be. It can't say anything. Right? So you can add your guardrails in that sense by saying the format has to be in this way, it has to pick from these things. So I think the way that you use the large language model and the way you ask it to give the output is going to tie in a lot with the risk ranking.
Awesome. Sorry, Kim.
Yeah, and complexity of a model is already a problem in general. Supervised learning, I think LLMs have just taken it to another order of magnitude, because in regular supervised learning, if you're dealing with a large tree-based model or a neural network or some big ensemble of the two, it's hard to figure out exactly what the model is calculating or how it's coming to a decision. You can get some relationship between features and the model output, but so we've been dealing with complexity of models for quite a while. We're just dealing with something on a we're just dealing with neural networks on a much larger order of magnitude now. And yeah, it's important to thoroughly test the model for various features of responsible AI.
I think the concept of risk rating is just incredibly powerful to use into our product line. So it's really a great question that way. The last time it was not good, you start CRISIL rating it or Moody's rating it, BBB or AAA.
So we have just a couple more questions. This is a pretty big one. Can you talk about some of the pitfalls, risks, weaknesses you have seen with using RAG for summarization and classification?
So I did a talk on this at our last conference, but I had done an application that looked through the earnings call transcript, and I wanted to see if I could use a large language model to read through that and automatically figure out what the stock price will be. Can we figure out using large language models whether this earnings call is good, bad, neutral? And if I just ask that question, like how well did the earnings call go? It didn't do well. It always thought it was a good earnings call. The people in the company try to keep it upbeat, even if they're giving bad news. So there was a pitfall there. So what we found out with trying out different ways to do it is that if I first summarize the call and asking the large language model to look at whether or not they met expectations, and then on top of that summary, ask my specific questions, it did a lot better. Because RAG was trying to pick up any place where I talked about, they mentioned their expectations, they're always trying to be positive. So instead I had to do a two-step approach. So I think you have to really, it's really important to understand how RAG works, because then you'll know the limitations and then know how to get around them, essentially. There it is. Yeah, so that's the earnings call. So for example, it said that Netflix had a great quarter and it was their worst quarter. It was that one they announced last year where they had the first time their subscribers went down. It was really big news. But the large language model thought it was a good year because they tried to, or good quarter because they tried to talk about their new content instead. So it was really interesting to see how people, frame how they answer and how that can influence the large language model and the RAG as well, and different ways to kind of try to negate that.
So RAG can be a positive story out of a potentially dismal quarter.
Yeah, because they worded they spun a positive story, so it just understands what they said. So you have to kind of be more critical, just like if you were reading it, you'd have to think about how you would do it.
We have a couple more rolling in, but I was tapped on the shoulder that we're at time. Do we want to end with this one last question for the team? We got one more. It's a good one. Okay, do you have many smaller financial institutions as customers? And if so, how do they approach the model risk management with less internal technical resources?
Yeah, in terms of approaching kind of the model risk management process for smaller teams with less, for example, resources, that's kind of where we're really trying to help our customers with our platform be able to conduct a lot of these steps. I think there's a lot of guidance right now in terms of frameworks. A lot of them are voluntary. You kind of pick and choose what features you want to kind of focus on. And within our platform, we're really trying to make these steps easier when it comes to kind of like implementing these processes. And I think that's where the power of our platform really comes in. If we were trying to, some larger banks have a lot of resources to invest in developing really comprehensive policies, building things ground up. What we bring in as a platform is kind of simplifying these steps to make these checks, make these steps a lot easier. So even if we are a smaller team and we don't have as many resources to invest in kind of model risk management, we as a platform can help guide along the way and kind of simplify these steps so that it's even possible for smaller teams too.
So a public example, maybe you're going to go for it, Megan, is NA Bank Card is one of our mid-sized maybe customer, and they're public, and they're a smaller team, focused. We have a lot of small teams globally as well. IFCO in India, Tokyo Marine, they built a very small team, 4 folks. I think automation has helped a lot for them on the model building side, model validation side. If you're using repeatable process to build it, it's easier to test repeatably as well. But I think taking the learnings from the large customers we have, so we can give packaged almost upstream solutions that can be reused. I think that's probably the way. I mean, you saw the complaint summarizer today. If that can be a packaged solution, then it gets honed in by the superpowers of the large bank data scientists, but eventually becomes reusable for the smaller banks. I think over time, AI is going to go up the stack. The platforms are commodifying. So we have a small set of early adopting mid-sized small banks. They actually, unfortunately, need AI even more because they don't have resources, and they're getting the same amount of complaints, fraud attacks, or identity thefts, or regulatory needs for documentation. So I think they will need more automation, and I think hopefully we can learn from our deep partnerships. Historically, our partnerships have been with the largest banks, but now I think now that we can partner and co-create, we can potentially use the wins with you, the larger banks, to take them to the vast majority of the thousands of banks that can help. Experian, Equifax are some of our partners in that on the data side, but I think we think that banks themselves could be our partners in that. So, that last question? Questions or content? Prompt is the IP.
We actually have 2 more questions that are coming in, and we can definitely talk about them. But let's start with this one. This is another one that's also related to upskilling and doing, I guess, if you don't have enough resources. But it says risk management and governance boards don't tend to be technical. What are your recommendations for upskilling those roles to handle these emerging concerns?
That's a good question. I would say that even though someone isn't technical doesn't mean they couldn't intuitively understand how this is working. And I think we can see that with the rise of ChatGPT and just how everyone is using it. So as they're using it and playing with it, they'll start to understand how it works at a different level. But I would say that, and what we're noticing more is that a lot of this stuff doesn't have to be written in a technical way. You can explain it to, I think anyone can understand it if you explain it right. And it's more about that and taking away the language that prevents everyone from understanding it and trying to talk about it in a simple and concise way.
Yeah, and to quickly add to that, some of the really technical terms that are being used, especially in like frameworks or regulations sometimes can be broken down into something that's a lot simpler. Like Megan said, like you can hear the word like, monitoring for drift, and it's like, oh, what does drift mean? But really means, what it means is like the distribution of the data that you're seeing is different from when you trained a model and in production. So things like that, some of these terms can really be broken down into kind of more simple concepts that are more easily understood by maybe a non-technical person, or you can relate it to something that exists already.
Yeah, I think a lot of the high-level concepts like trustworthiness of the model, general trustworthiness and accuracy, fairness of the model, and yeah, just high-level ratings for different categories are pretty understandable for people at all levels. You'll probably want to have at least one data scientist somewhere who understands the more technical details, but yeah, I think a high-level summary for how the model's performing is going to be understandable by a pretty wide range of people.
I got one more. I know John wants to get going, but this is also a very good one. Are there any specific validation steps for the Gen AI models that are different from traditional machine learning models?
Yeah, definitely. Since it's just a different output, so it's not trained on a specific data set necessarily. It's been pre-trained, and it's just, it's not going to give you a number. It's going to give you a token or a series of tokens. So it's different. But I would say the validation is more intuitive. So I think there's one validation technique called COVE, which I think we might talk about it today. Chain of verification. And so, for example, ask the large language model a question: what presidents were from New York? It gives you an answer. Now say, okay, for each president that it listed, where are they from? So just kind of rewording the question in a different way to confirm that the two match up. That's one way for validation. So I would say it's almost more intuitive, the validation. A lot of people, could think of that. If someone answers a question, how would you ask more questions to test and stress test those results? Great.
I think this is a very hot topic. So the three speakers will be in the audience and would love to continue to break out into different sessions as throughout the day for Q&A, and a lot to learn from the audience as well. So thank you for being here. I think we'll kickstart the master class shortly. So thank you. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks.